Thanks very much, Catherine, and thanks everybody for attending today to listen to this talk about Frank Lawless and the War of Independence in Fingal. So as Catherine said, my name is Bernard Kelly. I'm Fingal County Council's research historian. Basically, I was taken on board to research Fingal during the War of Independence in the decade of centenaries and see what local stories and local colour we could turn out. And so one of the things that came out very strongly is obviously the role that Fingal played in the Irish Revolution and the role that Fingalians played in the Irish Revolution. And obviously one of the central figures in Fingal during the Irish War of Independence was Frank Lawless. So this talk is derived from an exhibition that we wrote for libraries, and you can see it there beside you. You can have a peruse afterwards. If there's anything I miss in the talk, everything we researched is there. So if I miss anything else, you can pick me up on it from the boards there. And really what I want to talk about today is basically Frank Lawless's track through the War of Independence, from his early life in politics up to his death in April 1922. And I want to apologise immediately. You can see there's a typo in the top corner. That's my fault entirely. Hopefully the content of the talk will help you to forget that I made a mistake on the PowerPoint. So really, what I want to take you on a journey today is through Frank Lawless's life, his involvement in local politics, his involvement in Republican politics, and his importance to the revolution in Fingal and to the Irish Revolution in general on a national stage. So to start with his early life in politics, Frank Lawless was born on the 10th of October 1870 to Joseph Lawless and Mary Ann Ennis. And he inherited both his profession, farming, and his politics from his grandfather and his father. His grandfather, Richard Lawless, was involved in the repeal movement in Swords, and he was a regular contributor to nationalist funds, and his name appears over and over again in local newspapers. And his father, Joseph, was a member of Ballarottery Board of Guardians and Dublin County Grand Jury. Frank Lawless himself first sort of appears on the nationalist scene in Fingal in January 1892, when he was elected as the Fingalian rep on the Dublin GAA Central Committee. At that point, he was already president of Fingalians GAA Club from some date in 1891 that I can't quite pin down. And obviously, if you have any information on Frank that I'm missing, feel free to let me know after the talk. So in June 1900, Frank was elected secretary of the Swords branch of the United Irish League. So the United Irish League was a moderate nationalist party founded in the wake of the Parnellite split of the Irish Parliamentary Party in 1891. And land reform was one of its major policies. So a prominent local farmer like the Lawlesses being involved in the United Irish League should be no surprise. So just very briefly then, for anybody who doesn't know, the Irish Parliamentary Party was founded in 1870 by Isaac Butt as the Home Government Association. And what it aimed at was a devolved parliament within Dublin for the whole island of Ireland. This split in 1890 and 1891 over Charles Stewart Parnell's involvement in a divorce scandal. And from 1900 onwards, the Irish Parliamentary Party was led by a man called John Redmond from Kilrain and Wexford. So it's important to point out at this juncture just how important the Irish Parliamentary Party was in Ireland and how much it dominated Irish politics from the 1880s onwards. The Irish Parliamentary Party was the voice of Irish nationalism before Sinn Féin. And so Sinn Féin and the Irish Volunteers, when they were founded later on, were seen as sort of radical splinter groups. So when we see Frank being involved in the United Irish League, it's an example of him moving in sort of moderate nationalist circles at the time. In January 1902, Frank is listed as the provisional treasurer of the Swords Gaelic League branch. And in January 1906, he's elected to the committee of the North County Dublin Farmers Association. So what we have up until January 1906 is the CV of a fairly standard cultural sort of moderate nationalist. He's interested in Irish sports, he's interested in the Irish language, he's involved in national politics and at the local level. And there's nothing hugely notable in his career as of yet. But things begin to change sometime in 1905, 1906. There's a turning point that I haven't quite managed to pin down. But what we do know is that in May 1905, he is involved in a very heated argument at a local government board meeting to select candidates for local elections. And in this argument, he's patronised by one of the elder gentlemen in the room, calling him a young man. So it sort of appears to reveal some frustration he had with the establishment. Another possible source of Frank's turn towards radicalism was in 1905, when his mother Mary Ann was fined under what was called the Summary Jurisdiction Act of 1857. This was an 1857 omnibus law that directed cart owners to write the name of their company, quote, legibly on the side of the cart. And because the Lawlesses owned a butcher shop in the town, they had to have a cart for business purposes. So cart owners had to write the name of their company, and the quote in the act was legibly. So this act was used to prosecute people basically who wrote the name of their business in Irish on their vehicles. So under this act, in November 1905, Mary Ann Lawless is fined, but Mary Ann refused to pay the fine. And the police subsequently arrived up at the Lawless farm and seized a couch to cover the £2 of the fine that had been levied, which she again refused to pay. So then local legend has it that the police seized the couch from the house and then had to ask Mary Ann to use the cart to bring her back to the barracks in town. In November 1907, Frank Lawless presided over the setting up of a branch of the National Council in Swords. And the National Council was something that was dedicated to getting Republican candidates elected to local posts. And the extent of Frank's political evolution away from moderate nationalism can be seen in the speech that he gave at this event. He said, quote, "I was a member of the Land League and later of the United Irish League, but since Parnell's death, every year that passes strengthens my belief that no good can come to this country through parliamentarianism." So what we have here at the end of 1907 is a man who has seemingly abandoned his earlier moderate nationalist views and has moved in a much more radical direction. So we know that he was a member of the Irish Republican Brotherhood, but we don't know exactly when he joined. And the key fact about the IRB was that it was a secret, oath-bound society, and its primary tactic was to infiltrate and take over nationalist groups, turning them to its own purposes. We don't know the extent to which Frank Lawless was involved, but if he was a committed member of the IRB, then it's possible he was using his sporting and cultural activity to build up a Republican network across Fingal. So we don't know whether he had a genuine turn from moderate nationalism to republicanism, or if it was a tactic all along as a member of the IRB, or a combination of both. So this explains his seemingly abrupt break with the United Irish League. So from 1908 onwards, we move much closer into Republican activity. And we see Frank Lawless emerge not just on the local stage, but on the national stage of the Republican movement. Between 1908 and 1913, he becomes heavily involved in Sinn Féin alongside other well-known Republicans such as Arthur Griffith, Sean T. O'Kelly, Bulmer Hobson, and W.T. Cosgrave. In September 1909, Frank Lawless is elected to the Sinn Féin Resident Council, which is the national administrative body for Sinn Féin in the country. When his mother died in February 1911, the Sinn Féin executive voted a resolution of sympathy to the family, which again shows, by this stage, his national prominence. The next big move that he was involved in was, of course, the foundation of the Irish Volunteers in November 1913. The Irish Volunteers were set up in response to the foundation of the Ulster Volunteer Force the previous year. The Irish Volunteers, of course, were dedicated to the achievement of Irish independence, which was a kind of a loosely defined term, and the UVF's aim was to stop Home Rule in Ireland. And so the island looked to be on the edge of civil war at the very same time as war looked to be breaking out in Europe. The volunteer movement spread quite slowly through Fingal once it was established in the summer months of 1914, and Frank was obviously deeply involved in its spread throughout the county. He was present at a volunteer recruitment rally in Donabate in June 1914, and he told the crowd that, quote, "they should claim the right as citizens to carry arms. Very soon, perhaps, they might be called upon to use them, and on the other hand, the occasion might not arise." And he was obviously being very careful with his use of language there because there were police note-takers in the crowd. The leader of the Irish Parliamentary Party, John Redmond, then seized control of the Volunteers in 1914 by packing its executive with his own appointees, and throughout August and September 1914 made a series of speeches supporting the British war effort, because Britain had just entered the First World War on the 4th of August 1914. The most famous of these Redmond speeches was, of course, in Wooden Bridge in County Wicklow on the 20th of September, in which he urged the volunteers to join the British forces both at home and abroad. Off the back of this, then, the volunteer movement split into two factions. The vast majority actually supported Redmond, and about 160,000 followed him, and they rebranded themselves the Irish National Volunteers. And a very small minority, estimated to be between 10 and 12,000 across the country, kept the title Irish Volunteers, and they were fiercely opposed to any participation in the war. And you can probably guess which side Frank chose in this dispute. It's important to point out then that the Irish soldiers who died in their thousands at Gallipoli and at the Somme were largely those who answered Redmond's call in 1914 and joined the British forces. Between Gallipoli in particular is one vast Irish graveyard, and between Gallipoli and the Somme there is probably about 10,000 Irish war dead. And when you consider the fact that the total amount of Irish war dead during that conflict was 30,000, 1/3 of them died in those two campaigns in 1915 and 1916. As I said, Gallipoli in particular is a vast graveyard for Irish men, and that's where the 10th Irish Division was effectively destroyed. So Frank Lawless is heavily involved in the work then of reorganising the volunteers after the split, and he's present at the key meeting on 41 Kildare Street on the 6th of December 1914 when the new National Committee for the Irish Volunteers was appointed. At Board of Guardian meetings in Balrotherry, he regularly spoke out against the war, and he refused to allow any vote of thanks to local members of the British forces to pass, and often on these votes he was the sole dissenting voice. He worked tirelessly to refound the Irish Volunteers in Fingal, and then was appointed Brigade Quartermaster when the Volunteers was officially designated the 5th Battalion of the Dublin Brigade on the 10th of June 1915. This was done by Patrick Pearse, who was then the Director of Organisation for the Irish Volunteers, and was obviously one of the key organisers for the upcoming rebellion in 1916. So what you have then, by the start of 1916, we have a new sketch of Frank. Frank is a fully involved in national Republican politics, opposed to any Irish involvement in the First World War, and committed to armed rebellion against British rule in Ireland. The story then of the Fingal Volunteers is one of the few success stories of the 1916 Rising in a military sense. The rebellion itself was launched by a very small subset of IRB conspirators who had not told the Irish Volunteers Chief of Staff, Owen MacNeill, of their plans. The date of the rising was set for Sunday, the 23rd of April 1916, but when MacNeill found out that the rising was planned, he was horrified, and he issued what has become known in Irish history as the countermanding order, telling the volunteers to stay at home, which obviously had the effect of reducing the number of men and women who turned out. So the conspirators just delayed their plans by a single day and then launched the rebellion the following Monday, the 24th of April. But because of MacNeill's countermanding order, only very few turned out. The bulk of the fighting obviously happened in Dublin city centre, and large sections of the inner city were reduced to rubble by artillery fire. Smaller actions broke out in Galway and in Wexford, but by far the biggest outbreak outside of Dublin city was here in North County Dublin. The Fingal volunteers were mobilised on Sunday the 23rd of April at Rathmeal Cross, but it became clear that something very bad had gone wrong. So they moved from Rathmeal Cross to the Lawless farm at Saucerstown, where they were fed in the yard, and one of the volunteers recorded that they had a dance in the barn while they were waiting for orders to arrive. They were eventually sent home that night, but they were warned to be ready to turn out again at a moment's notice. And indeed, Frank Lawless then received word the next morning, the 24th of April, from Molly Adrian, that the rising was to go ahead at 1 o'clock that afternoon. So the 5th Battalion Fingal volunteers mobilised again, but this time only about 80 members turned out. And unlike in the city centre, it didn't occupy a single building and wait for the British to come to them. Instead, it formed itself into a fast-moving column and then ranged throughout the countryside. So to quickly run through just some of the events in Fingal in 1916, obviously they mobilised again at about 12 o'clock on the 24th of April. On the same day, on the 24th of April, they bombed the railway bridge in Rogerstown. And at the same time as that's happening, the rising is breaking out in Dublin city centre. On the 25th of April, they sent 20 men, including Frank Lawless's brother Ned, into the city centre at the request of James Connolly because of the countermanding order, because so few people had turned out. On the 26th of April, then they attacked the RSE station at Swords, and on the same day, they attacked the RSE station at Donabate. On the 26th of April, British forces landed at Skerries after the destroyer D. So such was the concern that the British authorities had about what was happening in Fingal, that they were landing troops directly off of warships. On the 27th of April, the RIC station in Garrettstown was attacked, and then on 28th of April, and we'll come back to this, obviously the Battle of Ashbourne happened. On the 28th of April, the Royal Navy sent a further ship, the cruiser Boadicea II, to Skerries, and then on the 30th of April, the 5th Fingal Battalion surrenders in a place called Newbarn. So if you follow the track of the Fingal volunteers during 1916, it's very much a sort of a fast-moving, fast-hitting sort of column that moves in position, carries out its ambushes, and then vanishes again. sort of like the template that would later be followed in 1919 onwards during the War of Independence. So one of the most fascinating things about this period in Fingal, and also sort of history in general, is that we sometimes tend to see things as a linear line. So I've just listed out what happened there in Fingal during the Easter Rising, as if it was some sort of a logical series of events. But obviously it was a culmination of improvisation, and the men would sit down and they would have a talk about where they were going to go next. But also we have to remember that different currents of Irish opinion were moving past each other at the same time. And the best sort of example of this was on the 24th of April 1916, the same day that the volunteers were taking over Dublin city centre, and the same day, and probably the same time, that the volunteers were mobilising here at Knocksedan Bridge. There was a recruitment rally being held in Skerries for the British forces, where members of the local recruitment committee were handing out certificates of honour to families, members of people who had been killed during the war. So different political thoughts, different currents of thought are moving past each other, sometimes in parallel, sometimes overlapping. And it's easy to sort of forget that all of these things sort of moulded in together to create the history of the period. So of course the major event, what happened in Fingal during 1916, is the Battle of Ashburn. On the 26th of April, the column attacked the RIC station at Ashburn in County Meath, and then they ambushed a column of cars that was filled with police that was coming to actually relieve the station. There then followed a 5-hour gun battle, which was one of the most hardest fought encounters of the Rising outside of the city centre. Frank Lawless himself was actually late to the battle, as he was the quartermaster of the battalion, so he was actually still back in camp gathering supplies and putting the medical supplies on the back of the bread van that the volunteers had commandeered. So he was late to the battle, as he'd been taking care of some supply issues in the camp, and when his section arrived at the battle, they took the police by surprise. And in the middle of this, the gun battle that ensued, Frank Lawless shot and then mortally wounded District Inspector Harry Smith, who had been attempting to rally the police. 8 police, including Smith, were killed. 2 volunteers, called Jack Crenigan and Jack Rafferty, were also dead, as were 3 civilians, one of whom was a civilian driver in the column, and 2 others that were killed in the crossfire. So the death of Jack Crenigan of the volunteers was a particular shock to Frank Lawless. Crenigan had worked as a labourer on the Lawless farm at Saucerstown and also went to the same school as Frank's son, Joseph. And in the actual heat of the moment, what happened, Frank's son, Joseph, recounted afterwards that his father was climbing up a ditch with a rifle. Jack Crenigan was standing in front of him. They saw Harry Smith standing up, the district inspector. They saw him standing up trying to rally the troops, and he was moving his arms like this, telling the troops to get up, or telling the police to get up where they were pinned down. And he saw the 2 men coming over the rise. He turned and he fired at Frank, because Frank was an immensely tall man. Frank moved and the bullet hit Jack Crenigan behind him. And in that same moment, Lawless fired back and hit Smith in the head. So not only was the death of a man that they knew so well a shock to Frank, Frank had come within an inch of death himself at the same time. Overall, though, the Fingal volunteers felt that the rebellion had gone very, very well. And so they were stunned to receive the news that Pearse had ordered them to surrender on the 29th of April. They sent representatives into the city centre, into Richmond Barracks, to find out what the story was. The order was confirmed, and they surrendered the following day. On the 9th of May 1916, Frank Lawless was court-martialed at Richmond Barracks and is sentenced to death, but this was almost immediately commuted to 10 years imprisonment. And then he was released on the 16th of June 1917 as part of the general amnesty of Irish prisoners, and he plunged straight back into Republican activism almost immediately upon his release. So he's released on the 16th of June. On the 9th of September, he presides over the establishment of the North County Dublin Sinn Féin Club's executive. On the 20th of October, he attends the foundation of the Rush, a Sinn Féin club. And on the 25th of October, he spoke at a Sinn Féin rally in Balbriggan, apparently sharing a platform with Dev. But most frustratingly, the reporter at the day didn't record what Frank Lawless said. On the 19th of December 1917, he was appointed director of Sinn Féin's agricultural department, recognising his background as a farmer. So Frank spent most of the period from mid-1918 to August 1921 in prison. And as a result, he was not involved in the War of Independence railing in North County Dublin. He was arrested on the 18th of May 1918 as part of the so-called German plot, and he was deported via Dunleary to Usk prison with Richard Coleman. While he was in prison, he was then elected for Sinn Féin in County Dublin at the 1918 general election. He missed the sitting of the first Dáil in January 1919 as he was released only on the 8th of March. In September 1919, the Dáil was declared illegal by the authorities, and Frank was arrested again on the 11th of November at the Dáil offices in number 6 Harcourt Street. He refused to recognise the authority of the court and refused to address the judge, and was sent to Mountjoy prison. He was released in Mountjoy on the 11th of February 1920, and he remained at liberty for only a few months before he was arrested again. The Lawless farm at Saucerstown was raided on the 13th of July and again on the 6th of August, but Frank was only caught at Smithfield Market on the 13th of December 1920. He was arrested by a mixture of Special Branch Police and the auxiliaries, and you have to remember he was arrested very, very shortly after Bloody Sunday in Dublin. And this is only speculation, but I believe myself that he was probably very lucky to survive being arrested by the auxiliaries, because he was arrested by F Company auxiliaries, who were one of the most notorious companies in Dublin city centre, and they were based in the castle. They were notorious for their ill discipline and brutality towards prisoners. So arrested on the 13th of December. On the 30th of December, he's interned at Ballykindler camp, County Down, and he remained there until the 8th of August 1921. And while he was interned, he's re-elected as TD for Dublin County Council unopposed. So mostly during the War of Independence, he wasn't present for it. He was in jail. So the Anglo-Irish Treaty, moving on to number 4 there. The Anglo-Irish Treaty then of December 1921 is probably one of the great turning points in Irish history. Just to do a very brief refresher course, but I'm sure everybody knows it very well. One of the consequences of the 1916 Rising was to spark the wider rebellion, the War of Independence. This traditionally, I guess, started on the 21st of January 1919 when the Tipperary IRA ambush on the RICE Explosives Party at Solohead Beg. And that ended then on the 11th of July 1921 when the truce came into effect. So it had become pretty clear to both sides that neither side could win a complete victory. The IRA didn't have enough strength to drive the British out entirely, while London realised that to reimpose its rule, Ireland would effectively have to be reconquered. And from reading the records of the time and sort of going through the newspapers and reading the witness accounts, particularly in North County Dublin, the extent to which the British authorities had lost control of the countryside is really very, very remarkable. They were unable to move in parties smaller than sort of 2 or 3 lorries, and at some times had even resorted to having to using aircraft to drop messages. So in October 1921, a delegation headed to Dublin to negotiate Ireland's new constitutional status, and this delegation included both Alice and Ellie Lyons, who were nieces of Frank Lawless, as part of the Secretariat. I won't go into the ins and outs of the negotiations because I'm sure everybody knows it very well, but after weeks and weeks of tense negotiations, the treaty was signed on the 6th of December. And what it did, it confirmed the existence of the 6 counties of Northern Ireland inside the UK that had been proposed in the Government of Ireland Act of December 1920. And it also provided for the creation of the Irish Free State as a dominion modelled on Canada, existing outside the UK but still within the British Empire. So this is far less than the 32-county republic that the IRA and Sinn Féin had initially fought for. This agreement immediately splits the Republican movement. I realise that I'm oversimplifying what happened in the run-up to the Civil War. I'm doing it for the purposes of time. So the treaty is hotly debated in the Dáil on Earlsfort Terrace between the 19th of December 1921 and the 7th of January 1922, and it passes through. It's ratified on the 7th of January by 64 votes to 57. This led to De Valera resigning as president and being replaced by Arthur Griffith. Meanwhile, Cumann and the IRA rejected the treaty. They repudiated civilian control, and the country slides towards civil war. So to take it back then to Frank, what Frank's involvement in this is that the Dáil records show that Frank Lawless was present for all 9 days of the treaty debates. The record also shows that Frank stayed in his seat when De Valera and his supporters walked out in protest. Now, we know that Frank was one of the 64 TDs who voted in favour of the treaty, but unfortunately I have no real idea what his motivations were. He remained completely silent throughout his entire time in the Dáil. There is not a single recorded word of him speaking in the Dáil, before, during or after the vote. If he committed his thoughts to paper on the treaty, it either hasn't survived or it's still stuck in somebody's attic waiting to be found. We know that the treaty had solid support amongst the middle class and that it was also being backed by the church. Both of these factors, and possibly the knowledge of the consequences of what might happen if it was rejected, may have played a role. It's a very famous fact that the British Prime Minister Lloyd George threatened the Irish delegation with immediate and terrible war if the treaty was rejected. My point is, I don't know if any, all, or none of these factors played a role in Frank's decision to vote for the treaty. It's all speculation. So with the Republican movement bitterly split on the treaty, on the 14th of April 1922, just over 100 years ago, 300 anti-treaty Republicans under the leadership of Rory O'Connor and Liam Mellows occupied the four courts on Dublin Quays, and much to the horror of my profession, took over the Public Record Office of Ireland. So this is a deliberate challenge to the new provisional government that had been set up by the treaty, and as I said before, the country is on the brink of civil war. So on the 16th of April 1922, which is only 2 days after the four courts had been occupied by anti-treaty forces, Frank Lawless and his son Colm were taking a pony and trap out for a ride at a place called Tonehill, just outside Swords. The pony that is pulling the trap is spooked by something. The trap mounts the ditch. The right wheel of the trap goes up in the ditch, and the trap overturns. Colm is lucky enough; he's sitting on the outside. He's thrown clear, and he falls to the road with only minor injuries. What happens to Frank is that the trap overturns on top of him. The back of his head impacts with the road, and he fractures his skull. He's treated at the scene by a doctor called R.J. May. He's moved very briefly back to Saucertown House, back to his farm. And from there, he's moved very quickly into Pembroke Private Hospital. And he died the next day without ever regaining consciousness. So why this is important is because his funeral was the thing that sort of sparked Fingal County Council interest in researching him during the War of Independence and the outbreak of the Civil War. His funeral is completely remarkable, not only because of its size, but because of its attendees. His funeral was held on the 18th of April 1922 at the Pro Cathedral. The coffin was draped in the tricolour, and it was carried by a military party. There was a parade of over 100 civic guards, the brand new police force, which was parading in public for the very first time. So the very first public parade of the guards in this country happened at Frank Lawless's funeral. And they had to, you'll see a photograph of it in the exhibition, they had to parade in civilian clothes because they didn't have enough uniforms yet to appear. Also at the parade, there was a body of National Army troops. There was representatives, over 100 of each of the 5 battalions of the Dublin Brigade. And then there was a huge list of political notables such as De Valera, Collins, Griffith, Pierce Beasley. Basically, all of the Republican and Nationalist heavyweights all attended Frank Lawless's funeral. So this is hugely important because of the context of the time. The country had already split over the treaty, and many of the politicians who attended Frank Lawless's funeral and stood side by side either in the parade or at his grave up in Rollstown had been hurling accusations of treason at each other only a couple of days earlier in the Dáil. In March 1922, the month before Frank died, De Valera had made that notorious speech in Thurles in which he stated that, quote, the IRA would have to wade through the blood, perhaps the blood of some members of this government in order to get to freedom. And it's hard now to sort of understand and recreate the poisonous atmosphere of bitterness that existed between the pro and anti-treaty sides. But such was Frank Lawless's stature, and such was his status both in the local and the nationalist movement, that all hostilities were suspended for the duration of the funeral. And it's very, very likely that this is the last time that the leaders of both sides of the treaty debate were all standing together in the same place. Frank Lawless's son Joseph recalled that De Valera and Arthur Griffith stood facing each other across Frank's grave once the ceremony had concluded. 2 months after Frank Lawless's laid to rest, the Irish Civil War officially, I suppose, breaks out when the Free State Army opens fire on the IRA occupying the four courts. Dublin city centre is again reduced to rubble as the army drives the IRA out into the countryside, recapturing the city on the 6th of July. The focus of the war then shifted to Munster and Connacht as anti-treaty forces resorted back to what they knew best, to guerrilla tactics. And Arthur Griffith, when we have a photograph there on the second last stand of him standing over Frank's grave, Arthur Griffith died of a brain hemorrhage on the 12th of August 1922, and then Michael Collins was shot dead in Cork 10 days later on the 22nd of August. And the Civil War grinds on until April 1923, when Frank Aiken and De Valera gives the order to dump their arms. By that point, probably about 4,000 people had been killed. The army had officially executed 77 Republican prisoners, as well as unofficially killing many more. And it's sobering to think that the Free State Army and the IRA men, who had paraded separately at Frank Lawless's funeral, were very likely involved in killing each other only a few short months later. So what's Frank's legacy? How is he important? Or why is he important? Well, his importance to the national movement in Ireland is unquestionable. We've walked through how he was involved and the extent to which he was involved in both the cultural, the sporting, and the political movements at a local and a national level. And it's not an exaggeration to say that Fingal probably wouldn't have played a prominent role in the revolution without Frank. His importance in the national movement is demonstrated by the size and the attendance of his funeral. However, his Republican activism and his undoubted importance to the history of this country, while we take that as being unquestioned, we also have to point out that this came at a real cost to his family. So his death left his wife Catherine to run a business, to run a very sizable farm, and also to continue to take care of his enormous family of 11 children, although some of them were close to adult at that time. We can see from earlier on in the talk just how busy Frank was in the various organisations, in the GAA, and the Gaelic League, and Sinn Féin, and the Volunteers. And a relevant question to ask here is, did he leave much time for his farm and his family and his business? And the answer appears to be, from the available evidence, that he didn't leave a lot of time, that a lot of the burden fell on his wife and his family. Also, he left behind an absolute mountain of debt that his family struggled to deal with in the years after his death. The debt that he left behind was close to £2,000, including overdrafts that were drawn on the land. Annuities still go owed to the government from the purchase of the farm under the 1903 Land Act, payments to local merchants, and payments to the Pearse's School in Rathfarnham. The government actually paid for his funeral, so they paid £96 for all of his funeral, and all of the records, all of the receipts, and all of the invoices for his funeral are all still in the National Archives. The government also gifted £1,000 to the family, and they gave Catherine, his wife, the balance of his TD's allowance, which amounted to £396. And all of this was still not enough to deal with the huge mountain of debt that was left behind him. Documents in the National Archives show that Frank's family negotiated with their creditors and with the government for years afterwards. And again, it's important to point out this is a direct consequence of Frank's death. Another interesting aspect of Frank that I didn't get into during the talk was that he was also a passionate anti-vax activist. And he was particularly opposed to mandatory vaccination. So how this came about is that while I was researching Frank, and I was finding his prison records for being lodged to Mountjoy after his court-martial in 1916, I discovered there was a previous conviction and a previous lodgement in Mountjoy for another conviction. So on the 24th of April 1915, Frank was actually convicted at Balroddery Board of Guardians for refusing to allow his children to have the smallpox vaccination. He refused to pay the fine, which was £1 for each child that he refused to get vaccinated, and he was committed to Mountjoy on the 29th of May 1915, where he served 2 weeks. When he returned to Swords after that, a rally was held to welcome him. 500 people turned out, and it was addressed by the leader of the Irish Anti-Vaccination League, a man called Ernest Bannister. And both Frank and Ernest's address nearly caused a riot. In Frank's own words, he was opposed to mandatory vaccination because it was unfair, because it was a flawed British law, and because he didn't believe it worked. So he was prepared to, and he did, go to prison for his beliefs. And it's interesting to see that his uncompromising stance towards republicanism and towards British rule in Ireland seemed to be reflected in other parts of his life. So he just appears to be a fairly strong character. And I picked the photograph there for the slides because I thought that the idea of Frank staring out at you, trying to intimidate you, was probably an accurate reflection of how he operated his own life. So in conclusion then, Frank Lawless's influence over Fingal in the revolutionary period was absolutely immense. He was at the heart of every sporting, every cultural, and every political organisation on the ground in Fingal. He constructed a Republican network across North County Dublin that facilitated the revolution. He was willing to turn his words into actions, as he did at the Battle of Ashburn, and his frequent stretches of imprisonment both in Ireland and in England are testimony to his willingness to act. For a time, the British considered him possibly, and you can see the quote on the exhibition that comes directly from his Dublin Castle intelligence file. The British considered him to be probably the most dangerous man in Fingal. And because I've come to know Frank quite well through this research, I suspect that he would quite enjoy that reputation. Thank you very much.